The night Elise was born, a terrible storm raged outside the hospital windows. Rain lashed against the glass as if trying to break through, and thunder rolled across the sky in deep, powerful waves. Some would later say it was as if nature itself was trying to give the newborn girl the voice she would never have. When baby Elise didn't cry, the doctors weren't immediately concerned. Some babies are quiet at first, taking their time to announce their arrival to the world. But as minutes passed, the room grew tense. The medical team worked quickly, and eventually, Elise made small, gasping sounds, enough to show she could breathe on her own, but far from the healthy wail everyone had been waiting for. 3 days later, Thomas and Vivian Cho took their daughter home with a troubling diagnosis: severe vocal cord paralysis. The specialists explained that Elise's vocal cords couldn't move properly to create sound. While some children with this condition improved over time, the damage in Elise's case appeared permanent. "She might never speak, but she'll be able to hear us, right?" Vivian asked, her own voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded. "Her hearing is perfect. She'll understand everything you say to her." Thomas, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Then we'll just have to find other ways to hear her." The first year passed in a blur of doctor visits, second opinions, and specialists who all came to the same conclusion. Elise would never speak. The Chos tried to adjust to a household without baby babble, without the sing-song conversations most parents enjoy. Thomas, a music teacher at the local high school, would sing to Elise instead of speaking, believing somehow that music might reach her in ways that regular speech couldn't. Vivian, who had once played cello with a chamber orchestra, found herself unable to touch her instrument in those early months. The silence in their home felt too heavy, too permanent. Elise was a watchful baby, her dark eyes following her parents around the room, taking in everything. She learned to communicate her needs through gestures and expressions. A certain look when she was hungry, another when she was tired. By her first birthday, she had developed a silent laugh that shook her whole body, her eyes crinkling at the corners just like her father's. When Elise was 18 months old, Thomas's mother came to live with them after falling and breaking her hip. Grandmother Lin, who had grown up in a small village in Taiwan before moving to America as a young woman, brought with her an old upright piano that had traveled across oceans and continents. "Music speaks when words cannot," she told her son as movers struggled to fit the instrument through the front door of their modest home. "This is my gift to your daughter." Thomas set up the piano in their small living room, tuned its strings with careful hands, and polished its wooden body until it gleamed. That night, he played a gentle lullaby while Vivian rocked Elise to sleep. It became their nightly ritual, Thomas at the piano, his fingers dancing across the keys while Vivian and Elise listened from the rocking chair by the window. As Elise grew from baby to toddler, she became fascinated with the piano. She would stand on her tiptoes, stretching her small fingers toward the keys, and Thomas would lift her onto his lap, guiding her hands to press down gently. The first time she heard a note ring out from her own touch, her entire face lit up with wonder. She pressed the key again and again, delighted by her newfound power to create sound. On the morning of Elise's 3rd birthday, Vivian was preparing breakfast when she realized the house was unusually quiet. Elise had been playing with her wooden blocks in the living room, but now Vivian couldn't hear the familiar sound of blocks tumbling against each other. Concerned, she wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and went to check on her daughter. She stopped in the doorway, frozen by the sight before her. Elise stood at the piano, her small body stretched to reach the keys, playing a simple pattern of notes. The same 3 notes that began the lullaby Thomas played every night. The notes were hesitant, sometimes missed, but the attempt was unmistakable. Elise was trying to recreate the music she had heard. Vivian held her breath, afraid that any movement might break the spell. She watched as her daughter's fingers moved from key to key, searching for the right sounds. Elise's face showed intense concentration. Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressed together in focus. When she found the next correct note in the sequence, a smile bloomed across her face. A silent celebration of her achievement. Quietly, Vivian stepped back into the kitchen and picked up her phone. She recorded a short video to show Thomas when he returned from the grocery store. This moment felt important, like the first real conversation they'd had with their daughter. From that day forward, the piano became Elise's territory. She would climb onto the bench several times a day, experimenting with different keys, different combinations of notes. Sometimes she would press a single key repeatedly, listening to how the sound faded away. Other times she would run her fingers across all the keys, creating wild cascades of sound that made her body shake with silent laughter. While other children her age were forming their first sentences, Elise was forming her first melodies. Thomas began to leave simple sheet music on the piano. Nothing complicated, just visual guides with colored stickers on the keys to match the notes on the page. To everyone's surprise, Elise took to it naturally, matching colors and finding patterns, her tiny fingers becoming more confident with each passing day. "She has a gift," Grandmother Lynn declared one afternoon after watching Elise play for nearly an hour without losing interest. The piano was becoming her voice. The doctors remained focused on Elise's throat, suggesting surgeries and therapies that might give her some vocal ability, even if just to produce simple sounds. But as medical appointments filled their calendar, Thomas and Vivian began to wonder if they were focusing on the wrong thing. "Look at her," Thomas said one evening as they watched Elise at the piano, now able to play a simple children's song from memory. "She's already found a way to express herself. Maybe we should be nurturing that instead of trying to fix what can't be fixed." Vivian struggled with this idea. She still longed to hear her daughter's voice, to know what it would sound like when Elise called her mama. But watching Elise at the piano, seeing the joy and purpose it gave her, was changing something in Vivian's heart. When Elise turned 4, they decided to find her a piano teacher. The first 2 teachers they approached declined politely, unsure how to instruct a child who couldn't speak or respond verbally to direction. The third, an elderly man named Mr. Zhao, who had once played with the National Symphony in his home country, didn't see any problem at all. "Music existed before language," he said simply when they explained Elise's condition. "We will speak through the piano." Mr. Zhao's methods were unconventional. Instead of starting with scales and theory, he began by playing duets with Elise. Simple call-and-response melodies where he would play a short phrase and wait for her to echo it back. Elise thrived under his guidance, her natural talent blossoming with proper instruction. She learned to read music properly, her small fingers growing stronger and more precise. What amazed everyone most was Elise's emotional range at the piano. Even at 4 years old, she could change the feeling of a piece through subtle variations in pressure and timing. The same sequence of notes could sound playful or melancholy, depending on her mood. She began to use the piano to communicate, playing bright, quick melodies when she was happy and slower, minor key progressions when she was sad or tired. By the time Elise was ready to start kindergarten, her parents had learned to listen to her in a completely different way. The piano had become her primary means of expression, more nuanced than the basic sign language she was learning or the simple written words she could now form. The night before her first day of school, Elise sat at the piano for nearly an hour, playing fragments of melodies that tumbled into one another without clear boundaries. The music shifted between excited trills and hesitant questioning phrases. Anyone listening could hear the nervous anticipation of a child facing a new challenge. Thomas knelt beside the piano bench and placed his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. "I know you're worried about tomorrow," he said. "It's okay to be scared. But remember, even when we can't be with you, He touched his heart, then the piano keys. "This connection stays with you." Elise nodded, her eyes serious. She placed her small hand over her heart, then reached out to touch her father's chest and finally pressed a single clear, resonant note on the piano. It was a promise, a declaration. Her heart, his heart, and the music that flowed between them. That night, as Thomas tucked Elise into bed, he whispered, "Tomorrow, you'll meet many new friends. They might not understand right away how you talk, but they will learn. And someday, my little one, the whole world will hear what you have to say." Elise drifted off to sleep, her fingers still moving slightly as if playing keys only she could see. Outside her window, a gentle rain began to fall, nothing like the storm that had raged on the night of her birth. This rain was soft, nurturing, like music settling gently over the sleeping world. Elise's first day of kindergarten was harder than anyone had expected. Her teacher, Mrs. Bennett, had been briefed about Elise's condition, but understanding something in theory is very different from managing it in a classroom of 25 5-year-olds. While Mrs. Bennet tried her best to include Elise in all activities, the communication barrier created moments of confusion and frustration. Children can be curious and kind, but they can also be bluntly honest in ways that hurt. By lunchtime, Elise had been asked a dozen times why she didn't talk, why she carried a small notepad around her neck, and why a teacher's aide shadowed her through the classroom. One boy had even asked if she was broken. The aide had quickly stepped in to explain, but Elise had seen the looks on the other children's faces, a mixture of pity and discomfort that made her want to disappear. When Thomas picked her up that afternoon, Elise's eyes were red-rimmed from crying. She had refused to use her notepad all day, keeping her thoughts locked inside rather than exposing her difference further. At home, she went straight to the piano and played a series of low, rumbling chords that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Thomas sat nearby, listening to his daughter's pain, knowing that this was just the beginning of a difficult journey. The world isn't always kind to those who are different, Vivian said that night after Elise had gone to bed. But she's strong, stronger than we give her credit for. And Elise proved her mother right. Over the following weeks, she developed her own way of navigating school. She learned which children were patient enough to wait while she wrote notes or used the simple sign language she knew. She discovered that bringing small drawings to share gave her a way to connect without words. And she found that some children were drawn to her quiet presence, seeing it not as a lack but as a kind of peaceful strength. A girl named Zoe became Elise's first real friend. Zoe was the opposite of Elise in many ways. Loud, constantly moving, full of energy that seemed barely contained by her small body. But she was fiercely protective of Elise and seemed to understand her in a way that even teachers didn't. Zoe learned basic signs just to communicate with Elise and often served as her interpreter with other children. "Elise says the clouds look like dancing elephants today," she would announce on the playground, after Elise had made a simple gesture toward the sky. Whether Elise had actually meant dancing elephants was beside the point. Zoe gave Elise a voice in the social world of kindergarten, and for that Elise was deeply grateful. At home, Elise's relationship with the piano continued to deepen. Mr. Zhao came twice a week now, and their lessons had evolved into something unique. Rather than following a standard curriculum, Mr. Zhao had developed a teaching method specifically for Elise that focused on emotional expression through music. "Play how the ocean feels during a storm," he would instruct, or "show me the sound of leaves falling in autumn." Elise would close her eyes, imagine the scene, and let her fingers translate the images into sound. The results were remarkable, compositions that went far beyond what most children her age could create, full of nuance and feeling. By the time Elise turned 8, she had progressed far beyond the level of a typical child pianist. She could play classical pieces meant for students twice her age, but what truly set her apart was her improvisational ability. She could sit at the piano and create music that seemed to flow directly from her soul, without the barrier of sheet music or formal structure. "It's as if she's speaking directly to us," Mr. Zhao told her parents. "Most musicians spend their entire lives trying to achieve this level of emotional communication. Elise has it naturally." At school, things had improved somewhat. Elise was now in 3rd grade, with a teacher who had made a point of learning sign language over the summer to better communicate with her. The class had a morning routine where each student shared something important from their day before, and when it was Elise's turn, her teacher would interpret her signs for the rest of the class. This small gesture of inclusion made a world of difference. Still, there were challenges. Group projects were difficult when other children grew impatient with the time it took Elise to write out her thoughts. Physical education classes often involved verbal team coordination that left her on the sidelines. And as her classmates' social lives became more complex, with inside jokes and quick-fire conversations at lunch tables, Elise sometimes felt like she was watching life through a window, unable to fully participate. It was during one particularly difficult week, after a substitute teacher had completely ignored her in class, that Elise's music took a significant turn. She came home and sat at the piano for hours, playing with an intensity her parents had never seen before. The music was complex and dark, full of dissonant chords that resolved in unexpected ways. It was the sound of frustration, of anger, of the deep longing to be heard and understood. Vivian recorded the impromptu composition on her phone and played it for Mr. Zhao the next day. The old teacher listened with his eyes closed, his face showing a mixture of emotions, surprise, admiration, and a touch of concern. "This is the beginning of something important," he said when the recording ended. "Elise is finding her true voice now, not just playing music but speaking through it." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But she needs more than I can give her now. She needs formal composition training, someone who can help her develop this raw talent into something structured." This led to the addition of a second teacher in Elise's life. Dr. Abernathy was a composition professor at the local university who rarely took on students younger than college age. But after hearing Vivian's recording, she agreed to meet with Elise. Their first meeting was awkward. Dr. Abernathy was brisk and formal, not used to working with children, especially one who couldn't respond verbally to her questions. She had prepared a series of exercises to test Elise's understanding of music theory, expecting to find significant gaps in her knowledge. Instead, she found a child who not only understood complex musical concepts, but could apply them in ways that were genuinely innovative. Elise might not have known the formal names for everything she was doing, but her instinctive grasp of harmony, rhythm, and musical structure was undeniable. "Play something for me," Dr. Abernathy said at the end of their session. "Anything you want. Something that tells me who you are." Elise thought for a moment, then began to play. The piece started simply with a delicate melody in the right hand that suggested vulnerability and questioning. Gradually, a counter-melody emerged in the left hand, stronger, more assertive. The two voices seemed to be in conversation, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always connected. As the piece progressed, it grew in complexity and emotional depth. There were moments of struggle, where dissonant chords created tension that seemed almost unbearable, followed by brief, beautiful resolutions that didn't last quite long enough before the tension returned. Throughout it all, the original melody remained, changing and developing but never disappearing entirely. When Elise finished playing, the room was completely silent. Dr. Abernathy sat motionless. Her usual professional demeanor cracked open to reveal genuine emotion. After what felt like a very long time, she spoke. "Most people spend their whole lives trying to say what you just expressed in those few minutes," she said softly. "You have a gift, Elise. Not despite your silence, but perhaps because of it. You listen differently than the rest of us. You hear things we miss." From that day forward, Dr. Abernathy became not just Elise's teacher, but her champion. She arranged for Elise to audit her university classes, sitting quietly in the back while college students twice her age learned the formal rules of composition. She found opportunities for Elise's work to be performed by student ensembles. And perhaps most importantly, she treated Elise not as a child with a disability, but as a serious musician with something valuable to say. By the time Elise turned 10, she had composed over 24 original pieces. Some were short, like musical sketches capturing a fleeting emotion or idea. Others were more substantial, telling complex emotional stories through carefully structured movements. All of them carried her distinct voice, contemplative, introspective, but with an underlying current of strength that seemed to grow stronger with each new composition. At school, Elise remained somewhat separate from her peers, but she had found her place in the world of music. She had a small circle of friends who accepted her as she was, with Zoe still at the center, now learning to play the flute so they could make music together. And she had her piano, her voice, her comfort, her way of being fully herself in a world that often struggled to hear her. One evening, as Elise practiced a particularly challenging passage from a Chopin nocturne, Vivian watched her daughter from the doorway. Elise's face was a study in concentration, her body swaying slightly with the music, completely absorbed in the conversation between her fingers and the keys. In that moment, Vivian realized something important. They had spent so many years thinking about what Elise couldn't do. They had almost missed the extraordinary things she could do. Elise might never speak a word, but her soul was singing, and the world was beginning to listen. The autumn Elise turned 13 brought changes that rippled through her life like wind across a still pond. Her body was changing, as were her emotions, sometimes wild and uncontrollable, at other times buried so deep she could barely access them herself. The only constant was the piano, where she could pour everything she couldn't say into the keys. Middle school proved to be a harsher landscape than elementary had been. The protective bubble created by understanding teachers and a small group of friends burst as Elise entered a larger school where most students didn't know her story. Here, her silence made her an immediate target for the kind of casual cruelty that thrives in middle school hallways. "What's wrong with her?" Elise would see lips form these words as she passed, the speakers not bothering to lower their voices, assuming that her inability to speak meant she couldn't hear either. "She's not deaf, she's mute," others would explain, using the word like it was something shameful. Notes appeared in her locker, some sympathetic but condescending, others openly mocking. A group of girls in her math class invented a game where they would ask her complicated questions in front of everyone, knowing she would struggle to write out a response quickly enough. Zoe, still fiercely loyal after all these years, fought back on Elise's behalf, sometimes literally, earning herself a series of detentions for confronting Elise's tormentors. But Zoe couldn't be everywhere, and much of the time Elise faced the gauntlet of adolescent social life alone. At home, she retreated further into music. The compositions she created now were more complex than ever, moving beyond simple emotional expression into something that felt like a complete language of its own. Dr. Abernathy, still her composition teacher after 3 years, recognized the shift immediately. "There's something different happening here," she told Thomas and Vivian during their monthly check-in. "Elise isn't just expressing feelings anymore. She's telling stories, creating entire worlds through sound. I've never seen anything quite like it, especially in someone so young." This assessment was confirmed when Dr. Abernathy entered one of Elise's compositions into a national young composers competition without telling her. The piece, titled simply "Conversations I Cannot Have," won first place in the under-18 category. The judges' comments noted the extraordinary emotional maturity and innovative harmonic language of the work, with no mention of the composer's age or circumstances. The victory brought Elise her first taste of recognition beyond her immediate circle. A local newspaper ran a small feature about the piano prodigy in their midst, complete with a photo of Elise at the keyboard, her dark hair falling forward to partly hide her face as she played. The article mentioned her condition only briefly, focusing instead on her musical achievements. For a few weeks after the article appeared, things improved at school. Some of the teasing stopped, replaced by a new kind of attention that wasn't exactly friendship but at least lacked hostility. Several teachers who had previously treated her with awkward pity now showed genuine interest in her music. The band director even asked if she would consider playing keyboard in the jazz ensemble, an offer Elise politely declined, knowing that the improvisational nature of jazz required a kind of verbal communication she couldn't participate in. But the respite was short-lived. Adolescence has a way of magnifying differences, and as her peers became increasingly focused on social interactions that revolved around talking, gossip, jokes, romantic confessions, Elise found herself more isolated than ever. Even Zoe, still her closest friend, was being pulled into new social circles that Elise couldn't easily navigate. The loneliness of this period transformed Elise's music once again. She began experimenting with dissonance and atonality, creating pieces that challenged listeners, that refused to provide easy resolution or comfort. Dr. Abernathy listened to these new compositions with growing concern. "There's anger here," she observed after Elise played a particularly jarring piece during one of their sessions, "and pain. That's natural, all artists draw from their emotional wells. But remember, Elise, music isn't just about expressing what you feel, it's also about connecting with those who hear it. The greatest music reaches out a hand to the listener." Elise considered this advice, turning it over in her mind during the long bus rides to and from school, during the silent meals with her parents who tried so hard to include her in conversations that inevitably moved too quickly for her to join with written notes. She understood what Dr. Abernathy meant about connection. It was what she longed for most deeply, but she didn't know how to bridge the gap between her internal world and the external one. The answer came from an unexpected source. That winter, Grandmother Lynn, now 82 and frail but still sharp-minded, moved in with them permanently. One evening, she found Elise at the piano, playing one of her newer, more challenging pieces. When Elise finished, expecting the usual polite but uncomprehending nod that most people gave her music, Grandmother Lynn surprised her. "You are fighting with yourself," she said simply. "Half of you wants to be heard, to connect. The other half wants to push people away before they can reject you." She sat down beside Elise on the piano bench, her tiny frame taking up barely any space. I understand this feeling. When I first came to this country, I couldn't speak the language. People looked through me like I was invisible. Some days I wanted to shout to make them see me. Other days I wanted to disappear completely. Elise looked at her grandmother with new eyes. She had never thought about Grandmother Lynn's own experience of voicelessness, how different it was from her own and yet how similar in the feeling of isolation it created. But I learned something important, Grandmother Lynn continued. The people worth connecting with will meet you halfway. You don't have to shout to be heard by those who are truly listening. She placed her gnarled fingers on the keys, playing a simple folk-like melody from her childhood. Some stories can only be told in music. Your job is not to make everyone understand, just to tell your truth as honestly as you can. That conversation marked a turning point for Elise. She began to compose music that maintained its complexity and emotional honesty but also offered points of entry for listeners, melodic themes that returned in recognizable ways, moments of harmonic resolution that provided emotional release. She wasn't simplifying her musical language, but she was using it more deliberately, with greater awareness of how it might be received. As spring arrived, bringing Elise's 14th birthday, an opportunity arose that would change the course of her life. Dr. Abernathy informed the family about auditions for the Westridge Academy of Music, a prestigious arts high school in a neighboring city. Students who attended Westridge followed a dual curriculum of academic subjects and intensive music training, with many graduates going on to conservatories or careers as professional musicians. Elise would have to audition, of course, Dr. Abernathy explained, and there would be challenges. The school has never had a student with Elise's particular situation before, but they have had students with various disabilities, and their faculty includes some of the finest music educators in the country. The prospect of attending a school where music was central, where her difference might not be the first thing people noticed about her, was both exciting and terrifying for Elise. She threw herself into preparing for the audition, working on both her performance pieces and her original compositions. Mr. Zhao, still her piano teacher after all these years, helped her select pieces that would showcase her technical abilities, while Dr. Abernathy helped her choose which of her compositions to include in her portfolio. The day of the audition arrived with the weight of enormous expectations. Thomas drove Elise to the imposing brick building that housed the academy, Vivian in the passenger seat checking and rechecking the folder containing Elise's music and paperwork. The car was silent except for the sound of rain on the windshield, a gentle spring shower that seemed to whisper encouragement. "Remember," Thomas said as they walked toward the entrance, "whatever happens today, we are already so proud of you." The audition itself was a blur in Elise's memory afterward. The gleaming black grand piano in the center of a wood-paneled room, the panel of 5 faculty members watching her with inscrutable expressions, the way the late afternoon light slanted through tall windows, painting golden rectangles on the floor. She played a Bach prelude and fugue, a Chopin nocturne, and one of her own compositions titled The Space Between Words. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence before the panel began to ask questions. This was the part Elise had dreaded. Dr. Abernathy had prepared them for this, explaining that the interview portion was as important as the performance. Elise had her notepad ready, but she knew how limiting it would be, how impossible it would be to convey complex thoughts about music through hastily written notes. The head of the piano department, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, asked the first question. "Your original composition shows unusual maturity. Can you tell us about your compositional process?" Elise began to write, acutely aware of how long it was taking, how the panel members were shifting in their seats. Before she could finish her first sentence, the woman held up a hand. "I apologize," she said. "Dr. Abernathy informed us of your situation, but I don't think we fully understood. Would you be more comfortable responding through music? Perhaps you could show us, rather than tell us, how you approach composition." Relief flooded through Elise. She nodded, turned back to the piano and began to play. Not a prepared piece, but an improvisation that demonstrated how a simple melodic idea could be transformed, developed, turned inside out and made new again. She showed them how she built harmonies, how she created tension and release, how she used rhythm to drive a piece forward or to make it pause in contemplation. When she finished, the panel members were leaning forward in their seats, their earlier impatience replaced by genuine interest. The questions continued, but now they were framed in ways that Elise could answer through demonstration rather than words. By the end of the hour, she felt, for perhaps the first time in her life, truly understood. 2 weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. Elise had been admitted to Westridge Academy with a partial scholarship. The letter included a personal note from the piano department head. "We believe your voice, the one that speaks through your music, has important things to say. We look forward to helping you develop that voice to its fullest potential." That night, Elise played for her family, a new piece she had composed just for this moment. It was full of hope and possibility, with an undercurrent of nervous excitement. As the final notes faded away, she looked up to see tears in her parents' eyes. And something else too. Pride, yes, but also a dawning recognition that their daughter was finding her way in the world, not despite her silence, but somehow because of it. The halls of Westridge Academy of Music bustled with energy on Elise's first day. Students rushed past carrying instrument cases of all sizes, from tiny flute cases to massive cello cases strapped to their backs like turtle shells. The air hummed with snatches of melody as someone practiced scales in a nearby room, while down the hall, a string quartet rehearsed a piece Elise recognized from one of her music theory books. For the first time in her life, Elise didn't feel out of place. Here, music was the primary language and everyone spoke it fluently. Even the regular academic teachers understood that their students lived and breathed music, and they often incorporated musical concepts into their lessons. Elise's history teacher compared the rise and fall of civilizations to the movements of a symphony, while her math teacher explained how certain equations reflected the same patterns found in Bach's compositions. Westridge assigned Elise a student buddy for her first few weeks, a junior named Lily who played the violin and had a younger brother who was deaf, which meant she already knew basic sign language. Lily helped Elise navigate the complicated schedule of classes, rehearsals, and practice times that made up the Westridge day. She introduced Elise to other students without making her difference the focus, simply saying, "This is Elise, she's new and she's an amazing pianist." The piano department chair, Dr. Reynolds, had arranged for Elise to have a tablet with a specialized communication app that allowed her to type responses quickly. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could match the speed of spoken conversation, but it was far better than the notebook she'd relied on before. The school also provided an interpreter for classes where discussion was essential, though Elise found she didn't need this support in her music classes, where demonstrations at the keyboard served her better than any words could. For the first semester, Elise focused on mastering the demanding curriculum. Westridge students were expected to maintain high standards in both their academic subjects and their musical studies. Mornings were devoted to traditional classes, while afternoons were split between private lessons, ensemble work, music theory, and composition. Every student was also required to practice at least 3 hours daily, with practice rooms available from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Elise thrived under this intensive schedule. Her technique improved dramatically under the guidance of her new piano teacher, Professor Chen, who pushed her to tackle increasingly difficult repertoire. In her composition class, taught by a composer in residence whose works had been performed by major orchestras, Elise's natural talent blossomed into something more disciplined and intentional. "You have instincts that can't be taught," the composer told her after reviewing a piece she'd written. "But instinct alone isn't enough. You need structure, technique, and understanding of tradition, even if you choose to break from it later." By winter break, Elise had settled into the Westridge community. She wasn't exactly popular. Her communication barriers still created a certain distance, but she was respected. Students would fall silent when she played in the practice rooms, standing in the hallway to listen. Her composition teacher shared her work with other faculty members, who began to take notice of the quiet girl whose music spoke so eloquently. Returning home for the holidays was harder than Elise had expected. After the constant immersion in music at Westridge, the house felt too quiet, despite her parents' efforts to make her homecoming special. Even the family piano, once her sole comfort, now felt limited compared to the concert grands she'd grown accustomed to at school. On Christmas Eve, while helping her mother prepare dinner, Elise noticed something she hadn't seen before: a touch of gray in Vivian's hair, new lines around her eyes. Her father, too, seemed older somehow. his movements a little slower as he hung decorations on the tree. And Grandmother Lynn, now confined mostly to a comfortable chair by the window, looked frailer than Elise remembered. Time was passing, changing all of them. The realization hit Elise with unexpected force. She had been so focused on her own journey, her own growth, that she hadn't fully registered how life continued to move forward for everyone she loved. That night she sat at the piano after everyone had gone to bed and played a piece she composed on the spot. A reflective, gentle composition that acknowledged the passage of time while celebrating the constants that remained. When Elise returned to Westridge for the spring semester, she carried this new awareness with her. Her music began to shift again, becoming more outward-looking, more concerned with connection and communication. Her composition teacher noticed the change immediately. "There's a new maturity in your work," he observed. "You're not just expressing your own experience anymore. You're trying to reach others to bring them into your world." This evolution in her music coincided with an important announcement. Westridge would be holding its annual Emerging Composers Concert in May, where selected student compositions would be performed by a professional chamber orchestra. Students had to submit their work for consideration, with only 6 pieces chosen for the final program. Elise knew immediately what she wanted to create, a piece that would serve as a bridge between her silent world and the speaking one, something that would make listeners understand, if only for a few minutes, what it was like to live in the spaces between words. She titled the piece, "The Sound of Silence," not knowing this was already the title of a famous song, and began to work on it obsessively. The composition took shape as a piece for piano and string quartet. It opened with the piano alone, playing a hesitant, questioning melody that seemed to be searching for response. The strings would enter one by one, at first not quite connecting with the piano's theme, creating a sense of isolation even within the ensemble. Gradually, moments of communication would emerge, brief instances where piano and strings found common ground before separating again. The middle section would build to a climax of frustration, with the piano's increasingly insistent voice drowned out by the strings talking over each other. Then, a moment of complete silence, a rest marked lunga in the score, meaning the conductor should hold it for an extended time, long enough to make the audience uncomfortable. After this silence, the final section would begin with the piano playing a new theme, simpler but more confident than before. The strings would enter again, but this time listening, responding, weaving their lines around the piano's melody in true conversation. The piece would end not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet moment of harmony among all the instruments, a musical resolution that suggested understanding achieved. When Elise submitted the score, she included a brief note explaining the piece's intention. 2 weeks later, she received notice that "The Sound of Silence" had been selected for the concert. More than that, it would close the program, the position usually reserved for the strongest work. As the concert approached, Elise was invited to attend rehearsals with the professional musicians who would perform her piece. The first reading was rough, with the musicians still finding their way through the unfamiliar music. But by the third rehearsal, something magical was happening. The performers had moved beyond the notes on the page to understand the emotional journey Elise had mapped out. The first violinist, a woman with 20 years of orchestral experience, approached Elise after the rehearsal. "I've played contemporary music for most of my career," she said, "but rarely something that feels this necessary. You're saying something that needs to be heard." The night of the concert arrived with all the nervous excitement such occasions bring. The auditorium was filled with students, faculty, parents, and music lovers from the surrounding community. Elise sat between her parents in the front row, Grandmother Lynn beside them in her wheelchair. The first 5 student compositions were received with enthusiastic applause, each showing remarkable skill for young composers. Then it was time for Elise's piece. The musicians took their places on stage, the pianist adjusting the bench, the string players tuning one final time. The conductor stepped onto the podium, made eye contact with each musician, and raised his baton. From the first notes, Elise could feel the audience's attention sharpen. The opening piano melody, so vulnerable in its questioning, created an immediate emotional connection. As the piece progressed through its journey from isolation to communication, the tension in the hall was palpable. When the long silence came in the middle of the piece, Elise could hear people holding their breath, feeling perhaps a fraction of what her silent world was like. The emergence from that silence, when it finally came, brought an almost physical sense of relief to the room. The final section, with its hard-won harmony between piano and strings, drew the audience deeper into the experience. When the final chord faded away, there was a moment of complete stillness. No one moved, no one even seemed to breathe. Then, as if a dam had broken, the applause began. People rose to their feet, some wiping away tears. The conductor gestured for Elise to join the musicians on stage, and as she walked up the steps, the applause grew even louder. Standing there, looking out at the sea of faces, her parents and grandmother in the front row, her teachers and fellow students behind them, strangers moved by her music in the rows beyond, Elise felt something she had never experienced before: complete connection. In that moment, she wasn't defined by what she lacked, but by what she had created. Her silence had become not a barrier but a unique perspective, a different way of experiencing and interpreting the world. And through her music, she had found a way to share that perspective with others. The conductor handed Elise a microphone, a seemingly pointless gesture that caused a ripple of confused murmurs through the audience. Then he smiled and placed it on top of the piano instead. Elise sat down, placed her fingers on the keys, and played a brief, impromptu coda to her piece, a musical thank you that was more eloquent than any spoken words could have been. As she played these final notes, Elise caught sight of her mother in the audience, tears streaming down her face but smiling with unmistakable joy and pride. Next to her, Thomas had his arm around grandmother Lynn, who sat straight in her wheelchair, nodding with each phrase as if to say, "Yes, this is exactly right. This is who you were meant to be." The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. When it finally subsided and people began to leave the auditorium, a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, broke away from her parents and approached Elise at the edge of the stage. The girl held out a small folded piece of paper. Elise took it and opened it to find a crayon drawing of a piano with sound waves coming from it, forming the shape of a heart. No words were needed to understand the message. Elise's voice had been heard, her heart understood, and in that understanding she had found her place in the world. The success of The Sound of Silence opened doors that Elise had never imagined possible. A recording of the concert had been shared online, and within weeks it had garnered thousands of views. Music blogs picked up the story of the teenage composer who couldn't speak but whose music spoke volumes. By the time Elise began her senior year at Westridge, her composition had been performed by chamber groups in 3 different cities. But with recognition came new pressures. Suddenly, everyone seemed to have expectations for Elise's future. Her composition teacher urged her to apply to elite conservatories. The school administration suggested a European tour for her work. Even her parents, who had always been careful not to push her, couldn't hide their excitement about the opportunities unfolding before her. Only grandmother Lynn, now confined to her bed most days but still sharp-minded, offered a different perspective. When Elise visited home for a weekend and played her newest composition, a piece she had written because her teacher said it would strengthen her conservatory applications, grandmother Lynn shook her head. "This is skilled," she said, "but where are you in this music? I hear technique, but I don't hear your heart." The comment stung, but Elise knew it was true. In the rush of attention following her concert success, she had begun creating music that she thought others wanted to hear, rather than the music that rose naturally from her own experience. That night, she sat beside grandmother Lynn's bed and wrote a promise on her notepad: "I will only write what is true." Returning to Westridge, Elise found herself at a crossroads. Application deadlines for music schools were approaching, and everyone assumed she would follow the traditional path for a gifted young composer: conservatory, advanced degrees, a career in academia or orchestral composition. But something about that path felt confining, as if she would be exchanging one kind of voicelessness for another. She began researching alternatives, spending hours in the school library and online. What she discovered surprised her: a whole world of music beyond the classical sphere she had inhabited. Film composers who created emotional landscapes for stories told in images, musicians working with doctors to develop music therapy programs for trauma survivors, experimental artists using technology to create interactive sound installations that responded to movement or light. These possibilities, excited Elise in a way that traditional conservatory programs didn't. But how could she explain this to her teachers, her parents, all the people who had invested in her talent? How could she make them understand that she needed to forge her own path? The answer came, as it always had, through music. Over the next 2 months, Elise worked on a new composition, one unlike anything she had created before. She titled it Beyond Words, and conceived it not just as a piece of music but as a complete experience. The work would combine recorded sounds from everyday life, the rhythm of rain on a window, the pattern of footsteps in a crowded hallway, the subtle melody in a mother's hushed voice as she sang to her child, with composed music that would weave these elements together into a coherent whole. Elise spent weeks recording these sounds, building a library of what she called the music of life. For the composed elements, she broke away from the purely classical approach she had been trained in, incorporating influences from minimalism, electronic music, and even hints of jazz. She used the piano as the central voice, but not in the traditional virtuosic way. Instead, the piano served as a guide, a storyteller leading the listener through a landscape of sound. Elise's composition teacher was initially skeptical of this approach. "This is experimental work," he warned. "It won't strengthen your applications the way a well-crafted string quartet or piano sonata would." But Elise was determined. She continued developing Beyond Words, now with the support of the school's technology teacher, who helped her learn the software needed to mix and manipulate her recorded sounds. By spring, she had created a 30-minute piece that existed somewhere between classical composition, sound art, and storytelling without words. For her senior recital, instead of performing standard repertoire as most students did, Elise proposed presenting Beyond Words as a complete experience. The school agreed, intrigued by her vision. The recital hall was transformed, speakers positioned around the room for surround sound, the lights programmed to change subtly with the music. The audience seated not in traditional rows but in small clusters that encouraged them to experience the piece from different perspectives. On the night of the performance, people didn't know quite what to expect. They had come to hear a talented young pianist play, perhaps with some of her original compositions included in the program. Instead, they entered a space that felt more like an art installation than a recital hall. Elise began by playing a simple piano introduction, establishing themes that would recur throughout the piece. Then the recorded sounds faded in, first the sound of breathing, then heartbeats, then a child's laughter, all woven together with the piano's voice. As the piece progressed, the boundary between real sounds and musical ones blurred. A section built around the rhythmic chopping of vegetables for a family meal became a percussion groove. The overlapping voices of a crowded cafe formed harmonies that the piano complemented and extended. The emotional journey of the piece moved from the isolation of Elise's early life, represented by sparse, disconnected sounds and lone piano notes, to the richness of connection, where all the elements came together in complex but harmonious relationships. The final section incorporated sounds from the Westridge campus itself, snippets of rehearsals, hallway conversations, the bell between classes, all transformed into music that celebrated community and belonging. When the piece ended, there was a moment of complete silence before the applause began. People didn't just clap. They talked to each other, sharing what they had experienced, pointing out elements that had moved them particularly. Elise's composition teacher approached her with a new respect in his eyes. "I didn't understand what you were trying to do," he admitted. "But this is genuinely innovative. You're not just writing music, you're creating a new way to listen." In the weeks following the recital, Elise made her decision about her future. Rather than applying to traditional conservatory programs, she accepted an offer from an interdisciplinary arts institute that would allow her to combine composition with sound design, music therapy, and multimedia work. Her parents, seeing her excitement about this path, supported her choice even though it wasn't what they had expected. "Your music has always been about finding your voice," her father said. "We trust you to know where that voice will be heard best." The summer after graduation was bittersweet. Grandmother Lynn passed away peacefully in June, with family gathered around her bed. Elise played for her in those final days, not composed pieces, but simple improvisations that felt like conversations between granddaughter and grandmother, filled with love and gratitude and gentle farewells. At the memorial service, Elise performed a piece she had written especially for the occasion. Unlike the experimental work of her senior recital, this was a straightforward piano solo, deeply personal and emotionally direct. It spoke of loss, but also of the gifts that remain, wisdom passed down, love that continues, voices that echo in memory. As summer turned to fall, Elise prepared to leave for the Arts Institute in a city 300 miles away. The night before her departure, she sat at the family piano one last time, the instrument that had first given her a voice, that had been her companion through all the struggles and triumphs of her young life. Her parents found her there early the next morning, still in yesterday's clothes, sheet music scattered around her, a new composition taking shape. Vivian brought her a cup of tea and Thomas sat quietly nearby, neither wanting to interrupt but both wanting to share these final moments before a new chapter began. Finally, Elise turned to them, reaching for her tablet to type a message. But instead she set the tablet aside and simply held out her arms. The three of them embraced in silence that needed no translation, no technological assistance, a moment of complete understanding. The drive to the Institute took 6 hours, the car filled with suitcases, boxes of music, and Elise's portable keyboard. As they neared the campus, they could see students moving into dormitories, parents helping carry belongings, the organized chaos of new beginnings. At the registration desk, the administrator checking Elise in looked up from her computer with a smile. "You're Elise Cho? The composer? We've been looking forward to meeting you." Elise nodded, suddenly nervous about this new world she was entering. "Professor Rivera from the sound design department specifically asked to be your advisor," the administrator continued. "She was deeply moved by your work beyond words. She said it reminded her of why she became an artist in the first place." That afternoon, after helping Elise settle into her dormitory room, it was time for her parents to leave. The moment they had all been both anticipating and dreading had arrived. "You'll call every week?" Vivian asked, then caught herself and smiled. "I mean, you'll text or video chat? And you'll come home for Thanksgiving?" Thomas added, trying to keep his voice steady. Elise nodded to both questions, then opened her tablet to type one last message before they left. "Thank you for always hearing me, even when I couldn't speak." Later that evening, after her parents had gone and she was alone in her new room, Elise opened her laptop and saw a notification. Someone had sent a message through her website, a space her father had helped her create to share her music. The message was from a girl in another country, who explained that she had a younger brother with selective mutism, a condition that made him unable to speak in certain situations. They had discovered Elise's music online, and it had become a way for him to express emotions he couldn't put into words. When he feels overwhelmed at school, the girl wrote, he puts on headphones and listens to the sound of silence. He says your music makes him feel understood. I wanted you to know that your voice has reached us here thousands of miles away, and it has made a difference. Elise read the message twice, then looked out her dormitory window at the campus spread below, at all the new people she would meet, the collaborations waiting to happen, the voices that would join with hers to create something none of them could imagine yet. Her journey from voiceless child to speaking through music had been long and often painful. There had been moments of isolation so profound she thought she would drown in silence, but there had also been those who listened deeply enough to hear what she was saying without words. Her family, her teachers, and now strangers around the world who found in her music a reflection of their own unspoken feelings. As night fell on her first day of this new life, Elise opened a blank document on her computer and began planning her next composition, a piece about journeys and transformations, about the many ways humans find to communicate when traditional paths are closed. She titled it simply, Heard. The piano in the dormitory common room would do for tonight. Her fingers were already itching to begin the conversation.